Hello everyone, it's great to see you again, and I actually just finished doing a review of Return of the Living Dead, and so while I was at it, I thought that I would go ahead and do a review of the sequel, Return of the Living Dead Part 2.
A secret that will be carried to the grave as the horror classic is reborn. Return of the Living Dead Part 2.
In this sequel to The Return of the Living Dead, a group of kids discover one of the missing military drums containing a rotting corpse and release the 2,4,5-trioxin gas into the air, causing the dead to once again rise from the grave and seek out brains. Hesitant to tell his family, Jesse, the youthful protagonist, remains secretive about the mysterious events. Soon after, however, the living dead find their way into the peaceful town. As brains are consumed and the townspeople are overtaken by the insatiable ghouls, Jesse, his sister, and their wacky acquaintances roam around town, attempting to escape by any means necessary.
Return of the Living Dead Part 2. Just when you thought it was safe to be dead.
Now, the Return of the Living Dead series is sort of interesting overall because basically what you had is with the first film and the second film, you almost had the exact same films, and that is to say that the second film sort of attempted to basically follow the exact same trend narratively, aesthetically, and so forth as the first film. But then you had the third film, which completely went way out in left field and did something different. And then you had these really awful sequels, 4 and 5, which were, actually, those aren't even worth mentioning. So basically, as I mentioned before, Return of the Living Dead 2 is, in some ways, exactly what you might want in a sequel, because it in many ways manages to mirror almost identically what the first film did. It included some of the same actors. Again, narratively speaking, it was almost the exact same thing. Again, even the character tropes were almost identical. The primary difference here is that they introduced a child actor who actually, I don't remember the name, but he does a fairly good job, and I think that in this instance, including the actor in this way and sort of attempting to do at least something a little bit different than the first film, managed to work pretty well overall. Sort of the downside to this, though, is that if you actually perfect something so well like they did in the first film, and then you attempt to basically mirror what you already did, it's like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If you attempt to do this, then where really do you end up going? Because if you've already perfected something, it can't actually get better. So essentially, the second film, although extraordinarily similar to the first, still never really manages to live up to the first movie, because again, the first movie is perfect, so I mean, really, where do you go from that point? So obviously, it's very tempting to basically just compare it to the previous film, and then kind of critique it on those grounds, but I don't think it's quite fair to do that, because obviously it is a separate movie, and so I think that rather than just merely critiquing it for that purpose, I think that it needs to be said that there are some really interesting things about this movie that I think are worth mentioning. So although the characterization and the characters themselves weren't quite as likable and weren't quite as witty, the dialogue wasn't quite on the same level as the first movie, the soundtrack certainly wasn't, they did have some interesting additions which I really liked a lot. So in this movie, rather than in the first movie, so in the first movie basically you only had 2 or 3 primary locations where things were happening. You had the warehouse, you had the cemetery, and then you sort of had a bit of the outside of the cemetery. But with Return of the Living Dead Part 2, you basically are given an entire tour of this relatively small town. So they basically go from house to hospital, to cemetery, to electrical fields, and so forth, which kind of gives more variety than the first movie, which I thought was a really good move. And you get these kind of interesting scenes where they're like trying to lure zombies into a trap, and so then they're giving them brains and so forth. And scenes like this and additions like this, I thought really made the film a lot of fun and definitely worth watching. However, one thing that I didn't particularly like that much was that the way that the film ended up actually going on toward the end of the movie, you So basically, I know that I said that I wouldn't do this comparison, but I'm going to do it a bit here anyway. In the first movie, what was kind of interesting about the dynamic of the zombies and the characters was that the zombies seemed to be essentially indestructible. So there wasn't really anything that you could do to stop them. You could cut them up, you could chop them into pieces, and they would just keep coming. And this is also in the case in the second one, but in the second one, again, maybe this may be a slight spoiler, but in the second one, they do manage to find a way that you can stop the zombies, and this is through electricity. Introducing this new aspect as a sort of weakness to the zombies, to me, sort of marginalized their threat, I suppose you could say. Because in the first movie, whereas you didn't think that there was any hope for survival unless you just captured them all and burned them, with the second one, you feel like you might actually have a chance because you found a way to combat the zombies. And this was something that I wasn't really sure that I liked that much, but it doesn't really bother me all that much. I still really like the movie a whole lot. But that basically summarizes my feelings about Return of the Living Dead Part 2. Again, I do highly recommend the movie, and if you are a big fan of the first one and haven't seen the second one, I think this is a case where you can definitely enjoy the sequel because of the very similar atmosphere and so forth that it creates. Overall, I would say that I would give this movie 4 stars out of 5, and again, that comes with a pretty high rating. So remember, you can watch Return of the Living Dead Part 2 on 80shorror.net along with over 600 other movies. So thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time.